The cold never left L1 Cerberus. It lived in the walls. It breathed through the ventilation ducts in slow measured currents that moved against the skin like a reminder. It settled into the bones of every man and woman who worked the command deck, a deep machine-born chill that no amount of coffee or body heat could fully drive out. The engineers called it the price of the processors. The quantum core running beneath the facility demanded a constant, unforgiving temperature to keep its calculations clean and its circuits from consuming themselves. So the cold stayed, and the people who worked inside it learned over time to stop noticing it. That was perhaps the most dangerous thing about it. Naval Station Norfolk had witnessed a great many things across its long and storied life. It had watched aircraft carriers slide out of its harbors at dawn, their flight decks carrying the accumulated weight of history. It had absorbed the tremors of wars beginning and ending. It had buried its dead with flags folded into triangles so precise they seemed less like cloth than like geometry, like the physical expression of a final argument. But LC-1 Cerberus was something different from all of that, something newer. Something that sat on solid Virginia ground without touching the ocean. It was built to defend a long, low structure of reinforced concrete and electromagnetic shielding that a passing driver on the access road might reasonably mistake for a government data center or a storage annex. No plaques on the exterior. No flags beyond the standard installation colors. No signage explaining what happened inside. What happened inside was the future of naval warfare fought and refought every day in the language of light and mathematics. The command deck occupied the heart of the building. You reached it through a series of biometric checkpoints, each one more exacting than the last. Each one a quiet reminder that the people cleared to work here were trusted with something that could not be replaced or recovered if it reached the wrong hands. The deck itself was a cathedral of humming servers, rack upon rack of black metal towers that stretched toward the ceiling and radiated that permanent, penetrating cold. At the center stood the primary holographic projectors, a circular platform ringed with emitter nodes capable of rendering an entire theater of naval operations in 3 dimensions, every ship, every aircraft, every submarine captured in glowing light with a precision that bordered on the devotional. It was by any reasonable measure one of the most sophisticated military installations in the United States of America. On a Tuesday morning in late October, it smelled like burnt coffee and ambition. Captain Harlan Mercer stood at the front of the command deck the way a man stands when he knows he is being watched and has decided to make that awareness work for him. He was broad-shouldered and sharp-jawed, the kind of face that looked carved rather than grown, the kind of posture that 2 decades of naval service either produces or destroys trying. His uniform was immaculate. Every decoration was exactly where it was supposed to be. Every crease could have drawn blood. He had the appearance of a man who spent time in front of mirrors, not out of vanity, he would have insisted, but out of discipline. The distinction mattered to him considerably. Around him, a loose arc of junior officers and enlisted technicians stood with tablets in hand waiting. Some were fresh from Annapolis. Some had a few years behind them, but were young enough that a direct compliment from a captain could still make their week. They were bright and capable and appropriately attentive, exactly the kind of audience that Mercer had spent 20 years learning to perform for. He was explaining Operation Black Spear, the war game currently loaded into the Cerberus simulation engine, a Pacific engagement involving 3 carrier strike groups, 2 opposing submarine fleets, and a contested airspace that demanded the kind of layered coordination that separated officers who truly understood naval doctrine from those who had merely memorized its vocabulary. He spoke with the ease of a man who had run this briefing many times, his voice moving across the cold air, with the natural authority of someone who had decided long ago that rooms belonged to him. And then he stopped. Not because he had finished his thought. He stopped because something had snagged in his peripheral vision, a shape that didn't belong, a presence that had not been accounted for in his mental inventory of the room. His eyes tracked left toward the primary command node and founder. She was standing near the main server cluster, close enough to the primary node that the blue operational light fell across her face in clean, even lines. She wore a flight suit, the standard issue olive drab of aviation operations, completely unadorned. No rank insignia on the collar, no name tape over the breast pocket, no unit patch on the shoulder. Nothing that identified who she was, where she had come from, or what possible purpose she had, standing in the most sensitive cybernetic command facility on the eastern seaboard, reading a tablet with the absorbed attention of someone waiting for a delayed train. She was a woman of perhaps 50 or perhaps somewhat older, the kind of age that settles differently on people who have spent their lives doing serious things in serious places. Her hair was pulled back with functional efficiency. Her posture was not rigid and not casual, but settled the way a tree is settled in the ground, as though she had simply been where she was for a long time and had no particular reason to be anywhere else. She did not look up. Mercer felt a shift in the room before he had consciously registered the reason for it. The junior officers had noticed him stop. They were looking at what he was looking at. A few of them exchanged glances. He cleared his throat. A warning shot. She turned a page on her tablet. Something moved in Mercer's chest that was not quite anger and not quite amusement, but occupied the neighborhood between them. He was a gifted reader of rooms genuinely, so the kind of social intelligence that didn't come from rank alone, but from 20 years of moving through spaces where hierarchy was the operating language and status was a currency he had learned to spend carefully. What he was reading right now was simple. An unauthorized civilian or analyst or contractor of some kind was standing in his command space without identification, without acknowledgement, without the basic professional courtesy of announcing her presence to the officer who ran the facility she was standing in. He smiled, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. Excuse me, even and controlled. The voice of a man establishing terms before the other party has had a chance to speak. Nothing. Ma'am? Sharper now, with just enough edge to make the junior officers near him find something very absorbing on their own screens. The woman's finger moved across her tablet, tracing what appeared to be a schematic of some complexity dense with layered notation. Mercer handed his own tablet to the nearest ensign without looking at him. The ensign, a young man named Caden Wren, took it carefully, the way you take something from a man who might want it back at any moment. Mercer crossed the deck toward her. His boots struck the raised metal flooring in measured, deliberate beats, the metronome of a man who has decided to be heard before he has decided to speak. I don't know what clearance level brought you through the front door, he said, keeping his voice just private enough to feel like a concession and just audible enough for every person in the room to follow clearly. But this is the Fleet Cybernetics command deck. Whatever your purpose here, you will identify yourself, your unit, and your authorization. And you will do it now. She didn't look up. The silence stretched like a wire being drawn too tight. Mercer was 3 feet from her, close enough to see the steadiness of her hands on the tablet, close enough to register something in her quality of attention that a wiser man might have stopped to examine before doing what he did next. But Mercer was not in this moment being wise. He was being a captain in front of his people, and that was a different and considerably more dangerous thing. Are you deaf? Nothing. He reached out. He closed his hand around her forearm with the certainty of a man who had spent his career believing that physical authority was the final language of command, and he turned her not gently and pressed her back against the cold face of the server rack behind her. The sound it made was soft, a dull metallic contact. The kind of sound that should not echo. But it did. It moved through the room the way a stone moves through still water, producing something that spread beyond its point of origin and could not be called back. The laughter that had been forming among the junior officers died. Not because they were instructed to be quiet, because they understood in the immediate and animal way that humans understand certain things, that a line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. Mercer leaned in. His voice dropped to the register menus when they need to be certain they are understood. For the last time, identify yourself, your purpose, and your authorization. Or I will have security remove you from this facility, and you will spend the remainder of your day explaining yourself to people far less patient than I am. The woman's eyes came up from the tablet for the first time. They were gray. The specific gray of deep ocean water on a windless day, a color that contained depth without displaying it. And in those eyes was something Mercer had not expected and was not prepared for. No fear, no anger, no embarrassment or surprise or defensive agitation. What was there instead was something harder to account for: a calm level quality of attention, the focused stillness of a mind processing at full capacity, all of it directed inward, everything working behind a surface that gave nothing away. She looked at him the way a careful scientist examines a specimen, without hostility, without judgment exactly, simply with the unhurried objectivity of someone for whom the observed phenomenon, whatever it is, represents datum rather than threat. Mercer held her gaze. He was practiced at this. He had closed many a standoff through the simple refusal to look away. But something in the quality of her attention made the contest feel less like a contest and more like a procedure, as though the outcome had already been determined by factors he was not aware of, and she was simply observing the final steps of something that had been in motion longer than their conversation. He released her arm and stepped back, gesturing toward the exit with the flat authority of a concluded matter. She did not move. He turned away, jaw set, and walked back toward the command area. He would have security called. He would have this resolved through proper channels. He was finished wasting the facility's time on a civilian who couldn't follow basic protocol. In the half-second that Mercer's back was turned, Ensign Caden Wren watched something that no one else in the room was positioned to see. The woman looked down at her forearm, the one that had been grabbed. It was a brief look, a fraction of a second, the kind of glance you give something, not because it hurts, but because it is familiar. There was no anger in it, no wince, a quiet acknowledgement the way a traveler notes an uneven stone on a road they have walked too many times before. Then it was gone. Her face closed. Her attention returned to the tablet. Wren stood with Mercer's tablet in both hands and said nothing. But he filed away what he had seen in the part of his mind that stores things without immediate context. Things that don't make sense yet, but that contain the shape of something that will. At the far end of this command deck, set back in the shadow of a server column, where the light did not reach him directly, Commodore Baxter Aldrich stood with his hands at his sides and watched all of it. He was a large man made compact by age, the way certain men grow denser rather than smaller as the years accumulate. His hair was the color of iron filings. His face carried the specific geography of someone who had spent 40 years making decisions that had consequences. Not worry lines, but concentration lines, the marks of sustained and relentless focus. He wore no readable expression. He had seen the woman the moment she entered the deck. Before Mercer, before anyone else. He had recognized her in the first second. Not because he had encountered her many times, though he had. He recognized her the way you recognize a master craftsman, by the manner in which they hold a tool, by the particular quality of her attention directed at her screen, with the absorption of someone in conversation rather than someone receiving information, by the distribution of her weight as she stood, the unconscious readiness built into her balance, the kind absorbed over decades in environments where the body must be capable of moving faster than conscious instruction can direct it. By the way she held the tablet as though it were an extension of her rather than a device she was operating. He knew exactly who she was. He also knew what today was supposed to be. 3 days earlier, a communication had arrived through a channel so restricted that fewer than 30 people in the Department of Defense had the clearance to receive it. The message had informed him that LC-1 Cerberus was scheduled for a blind readiness audit. The kind where no one on the facility knew it was coming. The kind designed not to test the equipment, but to test the people who operated it, their judgment, their responses to the genuinely unexpected, their fundamental character under conditions that provided no opportunity for preparation. He had been told who would be conducting it. He had not been told the exact day or the exact time. That was the point of the protocol. Even people with advanced knowledge of the audit's existence were kept in the dark about its specific timing. The uncertainty was a feature, not an oversight. It was designed to ensure that even the most senior observers could not knowingly prepare for the evaluation, that every response recorded would be authentic rather than rehearsed. What no documentation had anticipated was Harlan Mercer. Aldridge watched the approach. He watched the escalation. He felt something move through him when the physical contact happened, something that was part professional assessment and part something older and more personal, something that had no place in an audit record, but lived in him anyway. He stayed in the shadow. He did not intervene, not because he was indifferent to what was happening, not because he lacked the authority to stop it with a single word, but because he understood that what was unfolding was not an interruption of the audit. It was the audit. Every choice being made on this deck, every word spoken, every silence maintained, was data. Mercer's escalation was a data point. The crew's frozen inaction was a data point. And the woman's response to all of it was perhaps the most important data point of all. He pressed a small device in his breast pocket twice. Recording. On the primary holographic display, something was beginning to happen. A single line of crimson data drew itself across the lower quadrant of Operation Black Spear's luminous Pacific theater. Thin, precise. An anomaly in the data stream small enough to dismiss if you were not looking for it. Then another line appeared. And another. They multiplied with quiet, implacable logic, spreading through the simulation data, the way cracks spread through ice that has been carrying weight it was never rated for. Aldridge saw them. He looked at the woman by the server rack. Her eyes had already moved from Mercer to the display. And even from across the room, even through the shadow and distance, the fraction of change in her expression was visible to someone who knew what to look for. Not alarm, Usam, something more precise than alarm. The focused readiness of a person who has been expecting a particular development and has just heard the first indication of its arrival. Her hand moved to her tablet. Her finger found the screen. She had seen it too. Of course she had. Aldridge thought about the kind of mind it required to build what she had built, to design a system of this complexity and then return to it years later and read it the way you read a house you grew up in, knowing where every board creaks, knowing which windows stick, knowing the places where the settling of the foundation has put stress on things that were not designed to bear it. She had built Cerberus from the foundation, not managed its construction, not supervised its implementation. She had written its foundational code with her own hands when she was still a commander, working without sleep in a room that smelled of the same cold as this one, solving problems that had not yet been given names. When you build something from the inside, you know it by a different light than anyone who came after you can ever access. You know where you put the load-bearing elements. You know which solutions you were confident in and which you reinforced because a fraction of doubt remained. You know the things you didn't include in the documentation because they seemed self-evident at the time. And you know the things you placed in the deepest layers that no one has ever found because no one has ever needed them. Until today. Aldridge watched her thumb move across the tablet with the unhurried precision of a surgeon making a first incision in a procedure she has performed 100 times. He watched the crimson lines multiply across the holographic display. He watched her track them not directly because her eyes were on her own screen, but with some deeper attentiveness that functioned below the level of ordinary sight. She had seen this coming, he thought. Not just today. She had seen it 8 years ago when she was writing the code. She had identified this exact vulnerability, this specific combination of variables, and she had done something about it in silence without telling anyone, because that was simply who she was. The kind of person who solves problems before they have names. The kind who plants answers in the foundations of things so that when the walls finally crack, there is something in the structure itself that can hold. On Ren's console, a single alert tone sounded. Polite, almost apologetic. The kind of tone that sounds reasonable right before everything stops being reasonable entirely. He looked at his screen. He looked at the display. He looked at the slow, terrible proliferation of crimson lines spreading across the holographic sea chart that had been moments ago a clean exercise in naval strategy. He looked at the woman in the olive drab flight suit. She was already looking at him. Not at the display, not at Mercer, who was striding toward the command chair with a clipped order about security. Not at the other technicians beginning to notice the spreading red. She was looking at Ren, not with warning and not with threat, but with the quiet recognition of someone who has registered that a specific person is paying a specific kind of attention. She was making a note. Ren did not know what to do with that. He was 23 years old and 9 months out of Annapolis, and the most complex technical problem he had been trusted with at Cerberus was a firmware update that had not gone entirely as planned. He had no training that covered what was unfolding in front of him. No framework. No senior officer to turn to quietly and ask whether it was normal for an unidentified woman in a plain flight suit to be standing in the middle of the most classified cybernetics facility on the coast, weathering a physical confrontation from a captain while reading what appeared to be a live systems diagnostic, showing errors the main board hadn't registered yet. He looked at his console, then at her tablet. At the angle she was holding it, a portion of the screen was visible to him. What he saw on that screen he would remember for the rest of his professional life, with the same precision with which people remember where they stood when the world shifted beneath them. The screen showed a cascade of system log data, dense and scrolling, real-time. At the top of the visible portion, a yellow anomaly flag that the tablet's monitoring software had generated and timestamped. 7 minutes ago, 7 minutes before the first alert tone on his console. 7 minutes before the crimson lines appeared on the holographic display. 7 minutes before any piece of equipment in this room with its state-of-the-art hardware and its redundant monitoring layers had any indication that something was wrong. She had known before she walked in. She had stood against that server rack, had her arm grabbed by a captain who outranked every person in this facility, save one had been pressed against cold metal and threatened, and she had known the entire time. She had known the timeline. She had known what was coming. She had known with the precision of someone who designed the clock exactly how many minutes she had before she would need to act. She had used those minutes to watch. Because what was happening in this room, every choice and every failure of judgment, and every display of true character under unexpected pressure was exactly what she had come here to see. It was at that moment that the polite alert tone on Ren's console was replaced by something that was neither polite nor singular. The primary holographic display convulsed. The clean sea chart of Operation Black Spear collapsed inward, folding into itself like something dying, and where it had been, there was now a churning vortex of red static that pulsed with the irregular rhythm of a failing system trying to report its own failure. Every monitor on the command deck began simultaneously scrolling error messages, a vertical cascade of red text, each line a small specific catastrophe in the language of machine logic. The ambient hum of the facility, that constant undertone people had long since stopped consciously registering, climbed in pitch and fractured into something discordant and wrong. Then the synthesized voice arrived, calm by design. Someone had decided at some point in the facility's development that the voice delivering the announcement of catastrophic failure should at least sound composed about it. It filled the cold air from everywhere and from nowhere, landing in the chest like stones dropped in deep water. System integrity compromised. Protocol Omega engaged. All command functions locked. Mercer stopped walking. The junior officers stood motionless. Somewhere behind a console, someone swore in a voice stripped of everything except the raw, factual response to something genuinely frightening. The lights flickered. They shifted. The clean operational blue that had lit the command deck through every hour of every operational day tilted toward red, a slow bloom of emergency color that changed the character of the space entirely, making everyone in it look like what they had suddenly become, men and women in the dark reaching for controls that no longer responded. Harlan Mercer turned around. He looked at the chaos spreading across every screen. He looked at his crew pale-faced in the red light, hands moving across keyboards that refused to register input. He was a capable officer, within his domain genuinely skilled. He had navigated real crises on real ships with real lives at stake. But this was not his domain. This was a language he did not speak, a terrain he had never truly mapped, and the particular fear that comes from being responsible for something you do not understand was a kind that he had not previously had occasion to feel. It was specific, and it was humiliating, and it was total. He began issuing orders, clear and forceful, the only tool he had left. His voice carried. It had authority, but authority meant nothing here. Here the only thing that mattered was understanding. And in this room at this moment, understanding resided in exactly one place. Mercer turned instinctively toward the server rack. She was still there. The chaos had not moved her. The alarms had not moved her. The red light and the scrolling errors and the synthesized evacuation announcement, none of it had shifted her by a fraction of an inch. She stood exactly where he had pressed her, against the steel in the emergency red that made everything look like the final frame of something, and she was the only person in the room whose face had not changed, the only person in the room whose screen was not blazing with catastrophe. Her tablet glowed with its own steady blue calm and deliberate in the surrounding disaster, a fixed point in a space that had lost all other fixed points. Her hand moved to the front pocket of her flight suit, slowly, with absolute intention. She withdrew by first a short cable coiled and precise, and she held it for a moment the way a musician holds a bow before setting it to the instrument, with the particular quality of readiness that belongs to someone about to do the specific thing they were made to do. Then she looked up. Not at the screens, not at the alarms, not at Mercer, at Wren. He was the only one watching her. He had been watching her through all of it, through the confrontation and the timestamp, and the 7-minute gap between her knowledge and everyone else's. Through the entire quiet performance of a woman standing completely still in a room coming apart at its seams. She looked at him with those gray ocean eyes, and for the first time since she had walked onto the command deck, there was something in them that existed beyond pure observation. Something that, if you were standing where Caden Wren was standing in the red emergency light, with the facility's systems in full collapse around you, you might have identified as the closest thing to reassurance that a woman of her particular construction was ever going to offer. Then she looked away, and she walked toward the console that no one had touched in 14 months. The secondary engineering terminal had not been touched in 14 months. Wren knew this because he had been the one early in his assignment to Cerberus who had cataloged every peripheral access point on the command deck as part of a routine infrastructure survey. He had noted the terminal in his report as dormant, its interface outdated by 2 hardware generations, its maintenance port a relic of an earlier system architecture that the facility had long since evolved past. His supervisor had glanced at the notation, made a non-committal sound, and moved on. The terminal had remained where it was against the starboard bulkhead behind a secondary server column, the way furniture remains in a house after everyone has stopped needing it. Present, unnoticed, waiting for someone who had a reason to remember it. She walked to it without hesitation, not searching, not navigating. Walking the way you walk towards something you have always known is there, your feet finding the path before your eyes confirm it. Her route across the deckway was clean and direct, threading between the clusters of panicked technicians without touching any of them, without slowing, without looking at the screens, hemorrhaging error text on every wall. She moved through the chaos the way intention moves through confusion, not fighting its current, but simply finding the path that already existed beneath it. Ren remained at his console and watched. Around him, the room had become a different kind of place than it had been 90 seconds earlier. The transition from operational routine to systems catastrophe had the quality that certain disasters share. It happened slowly enough for people to register it, but too quickly for them to absorb it. Men and women who had trained for emergencies were now inside one, and training Ren was learning in real time is a substantially different thing from the weight of the actual moment it is supposed to prepare you for. Lieutenant Commander Oakes, the senior systems engineer on duty, was at the primary console with both hands moving across dead interfaces, her face carrying the expression of someone applying sustained force to a door that will not open. She had written the override manual for Protocol Omega 3 years earlier, a document that was now almost certainly useless to her because the failure had not behaved the way she had theorized it would when she was theorizing in a quiet office with no alarms running. The manual assumed a version of the problem. The problem had its own assumptions. Two younger technicians were speaking into communication channels that had gone silent, their voices progressively stripped of professional register, moving towards something rawer. A petty officer named Garrett had begun moving toward the reinforced emergency door, not for professional reasons. The synthesized evacuation announcement was still cycling, and his body had decided to take the instructions seriously regardless of what any protocol document said about abandoning a post. Captain Harlan Mercer stood at the command chair, not sitting, standing beside it with one hand on the armrest, the posture of a man who has reached for the helm and found it disconnected from everything it was supposed to control. His orders over the past minute had been correct ones, rational ones. Get engineers on the active consoles, establish a direct line to the base commander, get a manual override on the door locks. Each instruction sound in isolation. Each instruction assuming that the systems required to execute it were still responsive. They were not. And Harlan Mercer, who was a genuinely capable officer in the world of ships and men and physical consequence, was standing in a world that operated by entirely different rules and cared nothing for his qualifications in the other one. He saw her at the old terminal. She had already connected the cable. One end ran from her tablet. The other disappeared into the maintenance port below the console, a port whose interface standard had been deprecated from active development before half the people on this deck had received their commissions. It existed in the architecture the way vestigial structures exist in living organisms, a remnant of an earlier design that had never been removed because removing it had never seemed worth the effort, or because someone had decided it was worth keeping. Mercer crossed toward her. His voice had a new quality, now sharp in the way that fear makes things sharp, rather than the way authority makes them sharp. Fear and authority both use similar instruments, but people who are listening carefully can hear the difference. Get away from that terminal. Each word separate. The cadence of a man holding something together through the force of his own will. You do not know what you are touching. You will make this worse. She did not respond. Her fingers moved across the tablet surface. There is no adequate word for what her hands were doing except to say that it was not typing. Typing is transactional input, an output symbol, in function the mechanical execution of a known intention. What her hands were doing occupied the same category as playing a complex instrument, not the precise replication of a memorized sequence, but the live moment-to-moment negotiation between the player and the instrument, each one informing the other, each one answering the other, a conversation between human intelligence and something that was not quite alive, but was not entirely mechanical either. Lines of code moved across her tablet screen. Dense and vertical scrolling at a rate that should have been impossible to follow, the kind of information density that requires either specialized decoding software or a mind that has spent thousands of hours in direct contact with this specific architecture until reading it becomes something below the threshold of conscious thought. The way a musician reads a score, the way a navigator reads a chart, not translating symbol into meaning, but perceiving meaning directly without the intervening step. Ren had moved. He could not have said exactly when the decision happened or whether it was a decision at all. His body had simply oriented toward the only fixed point in a room that had otherwise lost all orientation and had closed the distance carefully without calling attention to itself. The way you approach something you are not certain you are permitted to approach, but cannot make yourself stay away from. He stopped 6 feet from the terminal, close enough to see her screen. He was looking at code he did not fully recognize. This stopped him, not because he was a novice. Annapolis had given him a solid technical foundation, and 9 months at Cerberus had sharpened it considerably. He had spent those months absorbing the system's architecture, learning the layered logic of its operational software, developing enough familiarity with its command language to navigate it with reasonable confidence. He knew enough to read most screens in this room on most days. He did not know what was on this screen, not because it was encrypted or obscured. Because it was operating in a layer of the system's architecture he had not known existed. The syntax carried the recognizable genetic material of Cerberus. The structural logic of its core framework was present the way family resemblance is present in people who share blood. But it was older, deeper. It was the bedrock beneath the foundation, the layer that existed before the layers everyone else worked on, and it moved with a fluency and precision that the operational software above it simply did not possess. It was the original language, the native tongue. Everything built on top of it was a translation. He watched her work. She moved through sections he had never encountered, pulling up modules with no reference in any documentation he had ever been given, calling functions whose names were opaque to him, but which the system answered immediately without resistance, as though it had been waiting for exactly this query. The terminal dark for 14 months was displaying data that the primary consoles with all their modern hardware could not currently access. She was moving through a door that no one else knew was there, and the building was letting her through. Then she pulled up a module he could partially read. Not the function itself, which was several layers of complexity beyond him, but the header, the metadata sitting at the top of any authored section of code, the administrative information that tells you if you know how to look certain basic facts about what you are looking at. Ren read the header. He read it twice, 3 times. Module designation failsafe theta. Classification level, a string of access codes that exceeded the highest clearance Ren had ever seen on any document at Cerberus. And below that in the authorship field EV, and a date, not today, not last year, a date from 8 years ago. He went very still. He processed it the way careful minds process things that fundamentally reorganize their understanding of recent events methodically without the luxury of disbelief, building the implications forward one step at a time. She had written this 8 years ago. She had written a failsafe module and embedded it in the deepest accessible layer of the Cerberus architecture, below the operational software, below the maintenance systems, below the security protocols, below everything any daily user of this facility would ever have occasion to look at. She had placed it there and had not put it in the documentation and had not told anyone it existed because she had seen this failure coming. 8 years ago, while she was writing the foundational code that everything else in this building ran on, she had identified the vulnerability in Protocol Omega, the recursive logic, the specific sensitivity to a particular type of data packet, the way those two characteristics under precise conditions could combine to trigger a cascade that the system would then interpret as external attack, compounding its own error until it threatened the integrity of the core. She had seen the black shape of what was happening right now in this room 11 minutes into a Tuesday morning in October, and she had put something in the foundation against the day it arrived. She had not come here to improvise a solution under pressure. She had come here to verify that the solution she had placed in the structure 8 years ago was still intact, still functional, still waiting where she had left it. She was not solving an unknown problem. She was confirming that a known answer built by her own hands into the bedrock of the building would hold when the building needed it to. The entire command deck, with all its experts and its state-of-the-art equipment and its decorated commanding officer, had never been the solution. It had never had access to what was needed. The answer had been in the building the whole time, placed there by someone who had understood years before anyone else had thought to ask the question what the building would eventually need to survive itself. Ren realized his mouth was slightly open. He closed it. On the main holographic display, something had begun to happen. It started as a single thread of white light in the lower left quadrant of the vortex of red static. Thin and steady, moving with the purposeful geometry of something being drawn rather than something occurring at random. It traced a curve. The curve continued. The white line moved through the red noise with the unhurried authority of a tide moving into shallow water, not fighting the chaos around it, but occupying space within it, one deliberate arc at a time. It was drawing a circle. A perfect circle, its geometry undisturbed by the turbulence of the failing display surrounding it, imposed on the disorder the way a proof is imposed on a question, the way the simplest and most fundamental mathematical statement asserts itself against the complexity it resolves. The nearest technician looked up from a console she had been staring at for 3 minutes and saw it. She went still. Garrett stopped moving toward the emergency door. Oakes lifted her eyes from the primary interface. One by one, without instruction, the room's attention shifted. Human attention under certain conditions recognizes when something genuinely worth watching is happening and moves toward it the way a compass moves toward north. Not chosen. Compelled. The circle completed. From its circumference, it expanded. Slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. The white light moved outward in every direction, simultaneously. A patient tide of order, displacing the red disorder of the display, replacing static with clean light, replacing noise with the geometry of a working system. Where the white reached, the red retreated. There was no violence in it, no drama. Simply the replacement of one state of being by another. The way a season changes, the way a wound heals not through force but through the patient operation of what was always designed to be there. The first alarm fell silent, not dramatically. It stopped mid-cycle as though its purpose had been quietly resolved and it had recognized this and decided it was done. The silence where it had been was jarring, the way the sudden absence of any long-standing constant is jarring the awareness of something arriving precisely at the moment of its disappearance. Then the second alarm, then the synthesized evacuation voice mid-word gone. The emergency lights steadied. They held their red for a suspended moment, uncertain, and then, with a sound that was less a sound than a collective exhalation, they shifted. The red bled slowly back into the operational blue, the clean and steady blue that meant things were as they were supposed to be, the color everyone had stopped noticing, because it was always there, which they now regarded with a specific and renewed attention, the people who had recently learned what its absence felt like. The holographic display resolved. The red static collapsed and vanished, replaced by Operation Black Spear, the clean three-dimensional C-chart turning in the projector light, patient and orderly exactly as it had been before everything had gone wrong. As though nothing had happened. As though the past 11 minutes had been a fever that had simply broken. The control consoles woke. Screens returned to operational status. Keyboards began accepting input. The building's environmental systems, the cooling architecture, the power distribution, the communications infrastructure, all of it came back in sequence, each system confirming the next, the facility returning to itself, the way a sleeping thing wakes gradually and then fully. The core coolant readout stabilized. The temperature gauges returned to nominal. The deep, familiar hum of the quantum processors settled back into its permanent undertone. The sound people stopped noticing after their first week, the sound Ren now understood for the first time as something that should not be taken as given. 91 seconds. He had counted without intending to. He had noticed the time when she connected the cable, and his mind had maintained the record the way minds maintain records of things they understand to be important. 91 seconds from connection to full restoration. 91 seconds to walk a system back from catastrophic core failure to complete operational status. Alone. With a tablet and a cable and access to a layer of the building that the building itself had almost forgotten was there. She unplugged the cable with the efficient motion of someone completing a routine task. She coiled it without ceremony, without the kind of pause that might invite observation, and tucked it back into the front pocket of her flight suit. She looked at the terminal screen for a moment longer, the look of someone confirming a result rather than savoring one. Then she turned. The room was entirely silent. 31 people on the command deck of Else-1 Cerberus stood in the renewed blue light and looked at a woman in a plain olive-drab flight suit who had just done something none of them could fully account for. Not applauding, not speaking. Standing in the fact of it the way people stand in the presence of something witnessed, but not yet understood, waiting for the world to provide a vocabulary. Harlan Mercer stood beside his command chair. The anger was gone from his face. The authority was gone. What remained was something Ren had never seen on a man of Mercer's type, before a specific blankness, the expression of someone whose working model of reality has been voided in real time, and who is standing in the wreckage of their own certainty without having yet determined how to proceed. He looked at the woman by the old terminal. He looked at the clean, functioning displays. He looked at his crew with their pale, mixed faces. He said nothing. There was nothing available to him that would have helped. Ren turned to his console. The security log had completed its automatic recovery sequence and was now displaying the full event record for the past hour. Standard protocol triggered by Protocol Omega's disengagement. He read it the way he had been trained to read it from the beginning, building the sequence forward in time. He found the originating anomaly immediately. The packet that had triggered Protocol Omega was logged. Its construction was logged. Its pathway through the network was logged. And its point of origin was logged. It was not an external intrusion. No hostile actor, no enemy state, no compromised credential. The packet had originated on the internal network from a specific terminal with a specific access profile, A terminal registered to a specific user account. Wren read the user account name, read it again, looked up from the console. Commodore Baxter Aldridge was standing at the aft entrance of the command deck. Not approaching, standing at the threshold, hands at his sides, his iron gray face carrying the same weathered, unreadable expression it always carried. He had been there, Wren understood without being told, before the system failed, during the failure, through all 91 seconds of the recovery. Watching from the shadow of the aft entrance, recording everything, intervening in nothing. Wren's eyes moved from Aldridge to the security log and back to Aldridge. The packet, sent from Aldridge's terminal, sent into the Operation Black Spear data stream at the precise vector and with the precise packet structure required to trigger Protocol Omega's recursive vulnerability. This was not an accident. The knowledge required to send that packet intentionally was extraordinary. The knowledge required to send it accidentally was a coincidence that Wren's rational mind refused to accept. Aldridge was watching him. Wren became aware of this with the specific prickling consciousness of being observed by someone who knows exactly what you are re-eating. He did not look away from the terminal immediately. He gave himself one more moment with the data because he understood that incomplete context was more dangerous than no context at all. The log told him what had happened. The why was the question everything else depended on, and he did not yet have it. He looked up at Aldridge. The Commodore's expression did not change. He was not guilty and not defensive. He was not attempting to communicate anything Wren could read with confidence. He was simply present with the particular gravity of someone who has made consequential decisions for 40 years and has arrived over those years at a certain peace with the complexity of their consequences. He gave Wren the smallest of nods. Not instruction, not reassurance, acknowledgement. The recognition of someone who knows what you have found and is not surprised that you found it and is not going to tell you what to do with it, because that is also part of the process. Wren stood at his console and held what he knew and what he did not know simultaneously, which was an uncomfortable position, and also he was beginning to suspect one of the more important capabilities available to a person who wanted to operate in the actual world rather than the version of it that training manuals described. He looked at the woman. She was looking at the holographic display, at the clean, restored image of Operation Black Spear turning in the projector light. Her expression had not changed from what it was while she was working. If satisfaction existed in her, it was not accessible from the outside of her face, and Wren was beginning to understand that satisfaction, as other people experienced it, the need to display having earned something to be witnessed in the moment of having succeeded, was simply not part of how she was constructed. He thought about the timestamp, 8 years ago, the fail-safe placed in the foundation. The problem solved before anyone else had asked whether the problem existed. He looked at Aldridge again. The Commodore was moving now with the deliberate stride of a man who has been waiting for the right moment and has determined that the moment has arrived. The crew parted for him without being asked to the way space reorganizes itself around certainty. He walked directly to the woman. When he was 3 feet from her, he stopped, and he drew himself to his full height, and he executed the sharpest, most formally precise salute that Wren had ever witnessed outside of a ceremonial setting. Not the salute of equals, not the salute of a senior officer acknowledging a subordinate. The salute of a man who understands exactly who he is standing before and is making that understanding unambiguous to every person in the room. Admiral Voss. He spoke her name and her rank, and the words settled into the cold blue air with the weight of something that did not need to be repeated. My apologies for the reception. I was not informed you would be conducting the inspection personally. This facility is yours to command. The room was very still. Wren looked at Mercer. The blood had left his face completely, not the pallor of fear, but of genuine comprehension, arriving with its full force, the understanding in real time of what he had done and to whom he had done it. Wren looked back at the woman who was Admiral Elena Voss and watched her receive Aldridge's salute with a slight nod, precise and unhurried, the gesture of someone for whom the form of recognition is accurate rather than gratifying. She looked at Aldridge. Something passed between them. Then she turned her gray eyes to the holographic display one final time, to the clean, orderly simulation of the Pacific Theater turning in the projector light, and she looked at it with the specific attention of a creator, returning to examine something they built a long time ago, measuring current reality against original intent. Whatever she found there, she kept to herself. Caden Wren stood in the blue light and understood with the clear and irreversible understanding that comes when a threshold has been crossed that the world he had inhabited that morning was not the world he was standing in now, and that somewhere in the layers of a system he had thought he understood, 8 years of silent patience had just kept 31 people alive. The holographic display turned slowly in the blue light. Operation Black Spear rotated through its simulation cycle with the patient indifference of a system that had returned to its last known state and continued from there unburdened. Systems don't carry the memory of their own failures. That particular weight belongs only to the people who were present when the failure happened. 31 people stood in the renewed blue light and carried it. No one spoke. The silence on the command deck of LC-1 Cerberus was not the absence of things to say. It was the presence of too many things to say and no framework yet available to say any of them in. The kind of silence that follows something that will take time to fully understand. Commodore Baxter Aldridge held his salute for 3 full seconds after he had spoken her name and rank. Long enough for the words to travel through every person in the room and find their specific place. Then he lowered his hand and moved to the nearest operations console and entered a brief command sequence. A service record populated the secondary display. Not a summary, a full record compiled over decades of consequential work in places and capacities that most people in uniform would never have occasion to encounter. The crew read it with the complete and undivided attention people give to information that reorganizes what they thought they knew about the past quarter hour of their lives. Unit, U.S. Cyber Command Special Operations Directorate, title, Director Project Chimera. Doctorate in Quantum Computing, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Doctorate in Systems Architecture, California Institute of Technology. The medals formed a column of official recognition whose length told a career's worth of story in the compressed language of institutional memory. Distinguished Service Medal. Defense Superior Service Medal with clusters. Legion of Merit listed 3 separate times, which meant 3 separate occasions, on which her service had been judged worthy of the highest non-combat decoration the Department of Defense could award. The qualification list continued beyond the medals program, names so restricted that their existence was classified above the clearances required to work in one of the most sensitive facilities in the country. At the bottom in the field reserved for mission classification status, a single line that communicated with elegant economy, everything that needed to be communicated. Wren read the line and understood for the first time that there were entire categories of consequence in the world he had not previously known existed. He looked at Captain Harlan Mercer. The man had not moved from beside the command chair. His hand remained on the armrest. The grip loosened now, the posture of someone holding on to something that has already stopped providing support. Every line on that display was a specific measurement of the distance between what he had assumed and what was true. Every decoration a data point in the argument his own behavior had constructed against him. The doctorate from MIT, the doctorate from Caltech. The career built in the classified architecture of systems that ran the digital infrastructure of American naval power. And the fact now, simply a permanent fact, that the woman he had physically pressed against a server rack bulkhead was the person who had written the code that the server rack was running. Mercer was not a foolish man. That was perhaps the most unrelenting part of what was happening to him. He was capable enough to understand with complete clarity the full scope of what he had done and what it meant. He had mistaken the absence of performance for the absence of substance. He had read silence as vacancy. He had encountered a form of authority so settled in itself that it required no announcement, and he had interpreted that quality as weakness because he had spent his entire professional life in a world where authority made itself known loudly, and he had long since lost the capacity to imagine it existing any other way. He understood all of this in the time it took to read a service record. The comprehension was complete and it was merciless. Aldridge turned from the display. He regarded Mercer with the measuring attention of a man who has already decided on a course of action, but is providing one final opportunity for the other person to demonstrate something worth noting before it becomes formal. Mercer demonstrated nothing worth noting. Aldridge spoke. His voice required no particular volume. Captain Mercer, Admiral Voss, is the lead architect of the Cerberus project. She authored the foundational code of this facility when she held the rank of commander 8 years ago with her own hands. The system you have commanded exists because she built it. You are standing in a room she made. You are relieved of command effective immediately. You will be escorted to your quarters and will await further communication regarding the proceedings that follow. The 2 Marines who had entered with Aldridge moved forward. They were not aggressive. They were simply present with the quiet finality of a door closing. Mercer looked at Admiral Voss one final time. It was the look of a man searching for something. Not mercy and not forgiveness exactly. The human need, even at the lowest point of one's own making, to be seen clearly enough that the witness recognizes you as more than the worst of your choices. Voss looked at him. She said one thing in the same even voice she had used throughout everything that had happened in the past hour, without triumph, without satisfaction, without any of the emotional register that the moment might have seemed to invite. You built your command on the assumption that silence means nothing. That assumption has been corrected. She turned away. The Marines guided Mercer toward the aft entrance, and he went with them without resistance, which was perhaps the first genuinely wise decision he had made since she walked onto his deck. The door closed behind them with a sound that was very soft for something so final. The room breathed. Oak sat down in her chair with the careful, deliberate movement of someone who has been standing for too long in a storm that has finally passed. Around her, the other technicians and junior officers began returning to their stations, moving back toward the ordinary, the way people return to it after extraordinary things, not because the ordinary has become ordinary again, but because the body insists on its own continuity, regardless of what the mind is still processing. Ren remained at the security log console. The log was still displaying the event record for the past hour. The entry indicating the origin point of the triggering data packet was still there, unchanged, carrying its timestamp and user attribution, with the patient, indifferent accuracy of a system that records what happens, without concerning itself with the implications. He was still holding two things simultaneously: what he knew and what he did not yet know. The log gave him fact. Context was a different matter entirely. He looked across the deck. Voss had moved to stand near the edge of the holographic projector, watching Operation Black Spear rotate in the light. After a moment, she scanned the room with a single measured look and found Aldridge near the aft console. She walked toward him. Ren made a decision. He crossed the deck and stopped at a distance that was respectful, but close enough to follow what was said, close enough to understand the shape of what was happening, even if individual words were partially lost to the ambient hum of the restored systems. He stood at that distance and listened. Aldridge spoke first. His voice was low and direct, carrying the tone of someone delivering information they know has weight, informing without apologizing. Ren heard the phrase blind readiness audit in the phrase standard chimera procedure, and then a longer explanation that he assembled from its fragments, a senior officer describing a process that had been set in motion before today, generated through a channel above the facility's administrative visibility, the exact date and time withheld from everyone at Cerberus, including people with prior knowledge of the audit's existence, including the woman standing before him. Ren assembled this slowly and then all at once. Aldridge's terminal had sent the triggering packet on a schedule that Aldridge himself had not determined. The schedule had been generated by the audit protocol of Project Chimera, a protocol whose parameters had been established years ago to ensure that no individual's awareness of an incoming inspection could compromise the authenticity of the results. Not the facility commander, not the base commodore, and not by deliberate, in specific design the architect who had created both the facility and the protocol itself. Voss had walked onto this deck this morning believing she was responding to an anomaly she had independently detected in the system logs. She had not known the anomaly had been deliberately seeded. She had not known that her response, and the response she was about to witness from the facility's personnel, were being recorded as part of an evaluation whose existence she had authorized years ago and whose timing she had explicitly surrendered control over. She had built a system rigorous enough to make herself a variable within it. The irony of this was so complete, so perfectly geometric in its integrity, that Ren needed a moment to hold all of it. She had designed an audit process that could not be gamed by the person who had designed the audit process. She had built the test and then accepted the test on the same terms as everyone else, with no advanced knowledge, no special allowance, no professional courtesy extended to her own position. The system did not recognize her as its creator when it was deciding when to break. It only recognized her when she reached into its foundation to fix what had broken. Aldridge finished speaking. Voss was quiet, not her operational quiet, which was a constant condition, a kind of permanent weather she carried everywhere. This was a beat of something else, a fraction of time in which something moved behind those gray eyes that had nothing to do with analysis and everything to do with the specific human experience of encountering an unexpected result in an experiment you designed yourself and having the intellectual honesty to receive it without adjustment. Then she spoke. 4 words, quiet and even audible to Ren from where he stood. That data point is noted. It was not sarcasm. It was not the resignation of someone absorbing a defeat. It was the response of a mind that had built a system to be honest even when the honesty was inconvenient and had just received proof that the system worked. She had designed the audit to be genuinely unpredictable. It had been genuinely unpredictable. The process had functioned exactly as she had built it to function, including the part where it functioned without her permission. She had also, Wren understood without having to be told, spent the past hour standing in an unexpected situation without any of the preparation that her reputation and her record might have seemed to guarantee her. She had been tested by her own test, and the data was in. Aldridge added one more thing. His voice was quieter now, and what Wren heard in it was the careful register of a man reporting something he had not anticipated. He had not expected Mercer to escalate to physical contact. The documentation had not predicted that variable. It was outside the range of reasonable assumptions about how a commanding officer would respond to an unauthorized presence on his deck. Voss was quiet for a moment longer than usual. Her eyes moved briefly to the server rack where she had been pushed against the steel. A fraction of a second, then her gaze returned to Aldridge, and her face was again what it always was. "That data point is also noted," she said. Her voice was the same. But the second sentence had a quality the first one had, not a weight behind the evenness, the weight of something filed and retained in a place from which it would not easily be retrieved, but from which it would not be forgotten either. Something passed between them in the silence that followed the shorthand current of two people who had worked alongside each other long enough to share a language that exists below language. Then Aldridge moved toward the administrative console to begin the post-incident documentation. Voss turned back toward the center of the room. She stayed for 7 days, no ceremony attached to her decision to remain. On the morning after the incident, the 0600 shift arrived, and she was simply present on the command deck in the same olive drab flight suit with the same tablet, and the shift took their stations and worked around her with the particular courtesy people extend to facts of the environment they have decided to stop being startled by. She did not lecture during those 7 days. She did not hold formal briefings or reorganize schedules or distribute reading materials or do any of the things a visiting flag officer could reasonably have done with a full technical staff who had just been made acutely aware of their own limitations. She walked the deck. She stopped at consoles. She watched technicians work. Sometimes she asked a question. The questions were short. They sounded simple. They were not. Why is this written this way? Is there a more direct path between these two functions? What do you lose if this module fails, and what have you built to account for that loss? The technicians answered. When their answers were good, she moved on without comment because a correct answer is its own reward and requires nothing added to it. When their answers revealed a gap, she sat down at the console, which was the only time she sat down, and she showed them not the answer, but the question that had to precede the answer, the prior question that made the right answer accessible. Then she waited while they found it themselves. She never told anyone what to think. She only ever showed them where to look. Wren became, without designation, the person closest to her during those 7 days. Not because he was the most technically accomplished person on the deck. Oakes was more skilled with systems architecture. Garrett, despite his movement toward the emergency door on the first night, wrote cleaner code. But Wren had a quality that she appeared to find worth something, and it took him several days to understand what that quality actually was. He formed questions instead of waiting for answers. Not constantly and not for display. But when he encountered something he did not understand, his instinct was to articulate the gap rather than paper over it or wait for someone else to fill it. In an institutional environment that trained people toward the performance of competence, this was less common than it should have been, and she had noticed it with the completeness and economy with which she noticed everything. On the 5th afternoon, she stopped at his console. He was reviewing the code from failsafe theta pulled from the system logs, annotating it in a separate file. He was not trying to reverse engineer it. He was trying to understand it, which is a different activity with a different aim, trying to follow not just what each function did, but why it had been built as it was built, rather than some other way. Trying to hear the thinking behind the decisions. She looked at his screen for a moment, said nothing. He said it's elegant. The word arrived before he had consciously chosen it. He was not certain it was precise enough, but it was what 2 hours of careful reading had produced in him, the sense that he was not looking at merely functional code, but at code written by someone who understood that function and economy were not separate virtues, but expressions of the same one. She turned and looked at him, the full attention of those gray eyes level and complete. Efficiency is its own form of elegance, Ensign. Never use 10 words when 2 will do. The same is true for code and for leadership. She held the look long enough for the words to settle. Then she moved to the next console. Wren carried those words through the remainder of his shift and into the evening, long after the day crew had gone and the deck had entered its quieter nocturnal rhythm. the way you carry something that has the shape of a key before you have identified the door it is meant to open. On the seventh morning, she was gone. No ceremony attended her departure. No farewell, no final briefing, no formal notation in the base administrative log. The 0600 shift arrived and she was not there, and her absence had the specific quality of completion, rather than disappearance, the difference between a door left open and a door properly closed. She had finished what she had come to do. She did not require acknowledgement for having done it. The command deck ran. The systems functioned. Operation Black Spear resumed its simulation cycle from the point where it had been interrupted, patient and orderly in the projector light, carrying no memory of the 11 minutes during which it had ceased to exist. The crew worked with a quality of attention that people bring to work after they have recently been made aware, in terms that cannot be argued with, of exactly how much depends on the quality of their attention. They were quieter than they had been before, more deliberate. They looked at the consoles they had operated for months with the fresh attention of people seeing familiar things through an altered lens, asking the prior questions, the ones that had to precede the answers they had previously assumed they already had. The change was not dramatic. It was not the kind of transformation that announces itself. It moved through the facility, the way the cold moved through the facility, present everywhere, felt in the bones, impossible to fully locate or fully escape. 3 days after Voss left, an unmarked package arrived for Ensign Caden Wren. It came through official logistics channels, which required an originating address and a recipient designation, but which did not in this case include a sender name or unit affiliation. It had been screened through base security and placed on the administrative desk with a notation indicating it was addressed specifically to him and should be delivered directly. It was small, the kind of package that contains an object. He opened it at his console during the mid-morning quiet period when deck traffic was at its lightest. Inside was a data slate, not standard issue hardware. A personal device, slim and precisely made, built to last rather than to be replaced on an institutional procurement cycle. No markings of any kind, no indication of origin. He turned it on. A single directory, one file, a source code archive whose file size communicated before he opened it that it contained the complete foundational architecture of LC1 Cerberus. Every layer, every module, every function and connection and pathway, from the surface operational software all the way down to the deepest tier of the building structure, the tier that most people who worked here did not know existed, and that Wren now knew better than almost anyone on this base. With annotations, not technical documentation, not maintenance comments, personal annotations, the kind that read like the marginalia of a book someone has lived with for a long time, the marks of a mind working alongside its own earlier work, questioning decisions made years before recording the thinking that the code itself could not contain, the reasoning behind choices, the alternatives considered and set aside, the problems anticipated before they were problems, and the solutions designed for them in advance. He read for 2 hours. He read through the operational layer and downward through the security architecture and further into the foundational framework where the earliest decisions lived, the ones that everything else depended on. He read the way he read things he understood to matter, not just for now, but for the longer trajectory of who he was in the process of becoming. He reached the section housing failsafe theta. He read through the module, carefully following the annotations, which were denser here than anywhere else in the archive. The marks of a mind working through something consequential and wanting to preserve the shape of the thinking that had produced it for whoever came after. The alternatives that had been weighed. The reasoning that had settled on this particular architecture and not another. The specific prediction of the failure mode written in plain language in the margin of a technical annotation, calm and precise, the description of a future event written in the past tense of someone who understood it as inevitable. At the bottom of the module, below the last functional line of code, below the closing syntax that ended the module's formal structure in the space that existed after the code was complete, and before the next module began, he found something that was not an annotation and not a function. A comment line, the kind that compilers ignore entirely, visible only to someone reading the source, directly looking at the architecture itself rather than the outputs it produces. Written in plain language in the same voice as every margin note in the file. He read it once quickly and then again slowly, the way you read something whose importance your first pass has already registered. If you are reading this, the system failed exactly as I predicted it would. That means someone built something worth breaking, and someone else cared enough to look past the surface and find the reason. You are not here by accident. Welcome. He sat with it. The command deck ran its quiet nighttime operations around him. The servers maintained their permanent cold node in the walls. The holographic projector cast its clean, steady light across the raised metal flooring, rendering the geography of a simulated conflict with the same patient precision it had always rendered, it carrying no memory of what had passed through the room in the past 10 days, asking nothing of the people within its light except that they be present and do the work. He thought about the date in the authorship field. 8 years ago, she had written that sentence and placed it in the deepest accessible layer of the system's architecture, below everything that anyone who worked here daily would ever have occasion to reach, and she had left it there, not knowing who would find it, not knowing whether the system would ever fail in precisely the way she had anticipated, or whether if it did, the person who followed the code all the way to its end would also follow the comment to its final line. She had not written it for a name. She had written it for a quality. He thought about what he had watched during the 7 days she had stayed, the way she moved through the deck without declaring herself, the way she asked the prior question and then waited, the way she had taught without ever standing at the front of a room, the way she had designed an evaluation rigorous enough to include her own assumptions as variables to be tested, a system honest enough to apply its own standards to its own creator. He thought about Harlan Mercer and the polished decorations and the voice calibrated for rooms and the hand that had reached out because it had run out of other instruments. He thought about the 14-month-old terminal and the cable coiled in a flight suit pocket and 91 seconds measured precisely by a mind that had known from the moment it walked through the door exactly how many seconds it would need. He thought about what it meant to understand something from the inside, not to operate it or manage it or supervise its operation, to have built it from its first principle, to carry in your mind the knowledge of where the load-bearing elements are, which joints are strong and which were reinforced because a fraction of uncertainty remained, where the weight lives in a structure and where it is simply transferred. He thought about the difference between authority that announces itself and authority that holds, between the kind that is built on the performance of competence and the kind that is built on competence itself, on the willingness to put the right answer in the foundation, even when no one will ever see it there, on the patience to wait in the structure of things until the moment when the structure is needed. He thought about a woman who had built a fail-safe for a building and left a note in it for a stranger, and about what it said about the nature of certain kinds of work. The kind done not for recognition, but for the sake of the work itself, not for the moment of credit, but for the moment of function. The moment when someone needs what you built to be there, and it is there exactly where you put it, exactly as you designed it, doing exactly what it was made to do. Wren had heard in the weeks following the incident through the institutional channels that carry such information in the form of reassignment notices and administrative updates that Captain Harlan Mercer had been posted to a logistics coordination office in the Nevada desert, a position with no command authority, no subordinates to address, no audience, for the voice he had spent 20 years sharpening into a primary tool. The official documentation cited crisis management deficiencies. Everyone who had been on the deck that evening understood what the documentation was actually describing. What those who eventually heard about Mercer's subsequent trajectory remarked upon was that he had not contested the reassignment. He had gone without appeal. Some who knew him said that in the months that followed, he had become a different kind of officer, quieter, more deliberate, better at listening than at speaking. Whether this represented genuine change or simply the adaptive behavior of a man with no remaining audience, no one could say with confidence. But the story that circulated through wardrooms and watch stations carried the incident not as a cautionary tale about the danger of assuming too much, but as something closer to what it actually was: evidence that certain corrections, when they come, go all the way to the foundation. The plaque that a machinist's mate on the next duty rotation quietly fabricated and mounted on the bulkhead above the secondary terminal, above the spot where she had connected the cable, read 4 words: "Efficiency is its own elegance." No attribution, no date, just the words in plain sans serif lettering on a small rectangle of brushed aluminum at eye level, where anyone coming to work at that terminal would encounter them without having to look for them. The terminal was no longer dormant. It had been added to the active maintenance schedule. Its maintenance port was now listed in the facility's official documentation. A junior technician had been assigned to learn its interface architecture as a secondary qualification, and that technician had been told plainly and without fanfare that understanding why a system element exists is as important as knowing how to operate it. Wren looked up from the data slate. The blue light was steady and cold and familiar. The servers held their note. The holographic projector cast its clean geometry across the raised metal flooring patient, and precise, the same as it had always been. the same as it had been on the morning a woman in an olive drab flight suit had walked through the biometric checkpoints and stood near the primary command node with a tablet in her hands in the full knowledge of the building in her mind. Outside Naval Station, Norfolk continued its permanent operations. Ships moved through the dark harbor water toward the open Atlantic. Aircraft cycled through their patterns above the Chesapeake. The whole complex machinery of American naval power ran on systems and infrastructure and foundational architecture that most of the people operating it would never fully understand and did not need to, because somewhere in the structure of those systems, in the layers below the layers, in the quiet places that no procurement cycle had ever flagged and no maintenance schedule had ever reached, there were things that had been placed there by people who understood that the work done in silence outlasts every decoration ever awarded for work done loudly. The cold lived in the walls. It always had. Wren set the data slate on the console beside him, picked up his annotating stylus, and started at the beginning. He had a great deal to learn. He intended to learn all of it.